I was hired to clean out an old mansion. What I found in the attic still haunts me. I've been a professional cleaner for years, specializing in old, abandoned properties. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays well, and I've always enjoyed the solitude. However, my latest assignment has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. It started like any other job. I was hired by a wealthy client to clean out a mansion that had been in his family for generations. The place was massive, with dozens of rooms filled with dust and forgotten furniture. My client, Mr. Dawson, gave me strict instructions to leave the attic alone. He said it was full of old family memorabilia and he would handle it himself. Curiosity has always been my weakness. After a week of cleaning, I couldn't resist the urge to take a peek. One afternoon, while Mr. Dawson was out, I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The door was locked, but a quick search through the house yielded an old key that fit perfectly. The attic was unlike any other part of the house. It was dark and musty, with a single window covered in grime. As I moved my flashlight around, I noticed a strange, metallic smell in the air. The space was filled with old trunks and covered furniture, but one thing caught my eye immediately: a large, ornate mirror leaning against the far wall. It was an antique, with an intricately carved frame that seemed out of place in the dusty attic. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight beam bouncing off the glass. As I got closer, I saw something move in the reflection. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, but there was nothing there. I turned back to the mirror, and my blood ran cold. The reflection showed the attic as it was, but there was a figure standing behind me, a tall, shadowy man with glowing red eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine as the figure raised a hand and pointed directly at me. I stumbled back, knocking over an old trunk. The figure in the mirror started to move, slowly stepping closer. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. Just as the figure was about to reach the surface of the mirror, I snapped out of my paralysis and bolted for the door. I slammed the attic door shut behind me and locked it. My heart pounded in my chest as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. I could hear faint whispers coming from the other side, but I couldn't make out any words. The metallic smell seemed to linger around me, clinging to my clothes. I decided to leave the mansion that night. I packed my things and left a note for Mr. Dawson, explaining that I couldn't continue the job. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house and saw a figure standing in the attic window, watching me. A few days later, I received a call from Mr. Dawson. He sounded frantic, asking me if I had gone into the attic. I admitted that I had, and he cursed under his breath. He told me that the mirror had been in his family for centuries and that it was cursed. Anyone who saw the figure in the mirror was doomed to be haunted by it for the rest of their lives. One thought he was crazy, but the nightmares began almost immediately. Every night, I dream of the attic and the figure with the red eyes. I feel its cold presence watching me, waiting for the moment when I let my guard down. I've moved twice since then, but the dreams follow me wherever I go. I've tried to destroy the mirror in my dreams, but it always reappears, untouched. I'm writing this as a warning. If you're ever cleaning out an old house and find a hidden attic, leave it alone. Some secrets are better left undisturbed. drove a 1971 Plymouth Barracuda. She was my pride and joy. As I gently filled her up, I subconsciously rested my eyes. I jolted back to lucidity just before I fully fell asleep. I realized I had overshot it and went back into the store to pay. The kid was gone, probably on a toilet break judging from the cans of Red Bull piled around his textbooks, so I left $10 by the register and called it a day. I got back in my car and got ready for the final stretch of the journey. Around 15 minutes later, I passed another car. It was a white sedan, fresh out of the 1980s. It was the type of car I would have whistled at if it drove by me in the street. On either side of the road was a thick forest, as impenetrable as the darkness just outside of the range of my headlights. I was used to a lack of sleep, but this was starting to get to me. I was chewing gum and listening to the radio. All it picked out was static, but that was better than silence. I had half a thermos of coffee resting on the back seat. I was planning on saving it for later on in the journey, but I had almost forgotten about it. As my eyelids became heavier, I took one hand off the wheel and tried to reach for the flask behind me. Still focusing on the road, I groped for it, but to no avail. My hand brushed past the cold metal, but I couldn't quite seem to grasp it. I exhaled and turned around. I saw the damn thing resting in between the two back seats. I reached over a little and grabbed it, and that's when it happened. I saw something streak across my windshield out of my peripheral vision. A great weight struck the car as I span around and stamped my foot on the brake so hard I thought the pedal would buckle under the force. My car came to a screeching halt. I sat there for a minute, my hands holding onto the wheel so hard my knuckles were turning white, and I tried to get my breathing under control. I thought about driving on and not looking back, happy to think I had just hit an unfortunate deer and left it at that. I had hit a deer, back in '98. This place was crawling with them, and they seemed almost suicidal, the amount of them that jump in front of cars this time of year. But I decided against that and, racked with anxiety, I got out of my car. Laying on the cold gravel of the road was a body. A human body. I stared in horror as I realized what I had done. His legs were a crumpled mess, his right arm was bent at an impossible angle, and his head. Oh God. His head bore the brunt of the force. It was bisected down the middle. His face was gone, unrecognizable, and clumps of gray matter oozed out from between two shards of his skull. The old, black frock jacket he had been wearing was now filled with his blood. My front headlight had shattered. I felt a twinge of guilt checking what damage was done to my car. It should have been the least of my worries, I know. As bad as it is to say, I was planning on leaving the body right there. Driving home and forgetting about the night with the help of my good friend Jack Daniels. But then I heard the low rumble of a motor. A car was coming. I was in fight or flight mode, and I did the first thing that made sense at the time. I had an old blanket in the trunk, laid out for my dog when we went to the beach. It stunk of wet dog, but somehow I didn't think the body would mind. I rolled it out in the road and pushed the new corpse onto it as the headlights of the oncoming car neared. The contents of his head were spilling out everywhere, so I grabbed a plastic Target bag and wrapped it around his head, keeping everything in one place. I lifted the body and, to my surprise, he was unusually light. It felt like lifting a small child. One cursed myself for falling in love with a car with such little space in the trunk as I crammed the body inside, closing it just as I was illuminated by a station wagon's headlights. To my horror, it did not keep going. It came to a halt next to me and the driver started to roll down his window. Instead of accusing me of murder, the tired-looking driver asked me for directions. I saw his wife sitting in the passenger seat, his 3 kids were in the back. All of them were asleep. The man asked me for directions to the nearest motel. The nearest one I could think of was a cheap shithole called Sir Sleep-A-Lot. I had stayed there when my marriage was on the rocks, just before the divorce. One told him he had missed the turn for it, and he had to turn around, drive for a mile and a half, take a left, then keep driving for another 2 miles. He smiled wearily and thanked me. He started to wind his window back up when he stopped. I was turning back to my car when he asked me if I had broken down and needed any help. I assured him I was fine. He thanked me again and took off into the night. I got back into the driver's seat and just sat there for a while, thinking about what I should do. I must have spent almost an hour, shivering in my seat, weighing my options. I've listened to enough true crime podcasts to know how to hide a body, but I didn't think I could stomach dismembering him. But I knew what I had to do. I started my car up and began the last leg of my journey. I passed the moss-covered sign welcoming me back to my hometown. I drove through the empty streets, each house occupied by a sleeping family. I pulled into my street, just on the edge of the suburbs. I realized, for the first time, that my hands were shaking. I tried to get it under control as I parked in my driveway and got out, stretching my weary legs. I made my way to the trunk and opened it. I half hoped the body wouldn't be there, and that this had all been some fever dream I had at the wheel. But, of course, it was still there, stained in blood and crumpled into the fetal position. Still wrapped in my dog's blanket and with a plastic bag bearing the Target logo keeping his head in one place. I leaned in to lift him out. As I did, a voice behind me said, with little emotion, "Hello." One whipped around. Standing by his car on the other side of the fence was my neighbor, a religious but sweet guy called Gary. I always saw him as my very own Ned Flanders. I slammed my trunk shut and nonchalantly leaned against it. I greeted him and we both just stood there awkwardly for what felt like a lifetime. Eventually, Gary said, "Well, see you later," before turning and getting in his car. I stood where I was and watched him drive off until he was out of sight. I wondered what he could be doing at 4:30 in the morning, but it felt weird of me to be suspicious of someone when I was about to bury the body of a man I had just killed. I made sure there were no other nocturnal neighbors around and I opened my trunk once again. I picked up the strangely light corpse and nudged the trunk shut with my elbow. I hastily walked over to my front door and set the body down, fumbling with my keys. I opened the door and dragged him inside. I pulled him across the carpet, wincing at the mess I had to clean up, and to the basement door. I opened it and gently brought him down the rotting wooden steps. There was a patch of dirt in the corner of my basement where an old washing machine had been. I kept meaning to cement it over, but, thankfully, never got around to it. I lay the body down next to the dirt patch. I rolled him out of the blanket and got a good look at him for the first time, not that I particularly wanted to. I bunched up the blood-stained blanket and set it down on a workbench I never used. My sister had been looking after my dog Lassie while I was away. I was supposed to pick her up tomorrow, but I didn't fancy the idea of digging up the remains. Since I didn't have a shed, I kept a shovel in the same little room under the stairs where I kept the boiler. As I walked back up the basement stairs, I realized my shake was back. The brevity of what I was about to do was taking hold. I made a B-turn to the kitchen and fumbled with the lock on my liquor cabinet. I took out a half-empty bottle of 90 proof and slumped into an old oak chair, the sole inheritance from my grandfather. Once it was finished, I began to reason with myself. I thought the man I killed might have been the person who was responsible for the recent spate of disappearances. A serial killer who was stalking the back roads late at night, who fell victim to a weary driver. If this was true, then what I had done was a net positive to the world, so I clung to that thought. That's when I heard a noise. It was the type of noise you'd hear as you were drifting off to sleep. The type of noise that'd tear you back into lucidity. I heard it again. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. I put the bottle down and made my way out of the kitchen. I stood in front of the basement door, waiting to see if I could hear it again. I must have stood there for a minute or two in perfect silence. I took a deep breath and grabbed the shovel from the cramped storeroom. Either way, it was time for me to do what needed to be done. With a heavy heart, I opened the door. Standing amongst the shadows at the foot of the stairs was the body. I realized, to my horror, that the noise I heard was the thing's bones snapping back into place. It stood there, staring up at me. It still had the plastic bag over its head, but I could tell it was staring directly into my eyes. I let out a whimper and took a step back. The body let out a shrill scream as its feet left the ground. It floated there for a second as I was frozen from shock. The body jerked and came hurtling up the stairs. I was snapped out of my trance and acted quickly enough to slam the door shut. The force that hit it from the other side shook the hinges. I gritted my teeth, desperately to hold the door shut as the bod pounded it and snarled from the other side. I looked down at the shovel by my side. I took a hand away from the door to grab it, and as soon as I did I felt the weight hit me. I almost let it loose from the basement. I grabbed the shovel and wedged it in between the door and the wall behind me. I mustered up enough courage to let go of the door and winced. Thankfully, the shovel was enough to keep it in place. One hopped over the spade, ran past the blood-stained carpet and, stupidly, ran past the front door. Instead, I went upstairs to my bedroom. I staggered to my closet and dropped to my knees. I took out the Webley revolver my father gave me when I first moved out. I kept it, along with some loose ammunition wrapped in a piece of tin foil, in a shoebox. I hastily loaded it and got to my feet. I held it like I had seen in the detective films. All I know about guns is they shoot. I never learned how to use them properly, never thought I needed to. I made my way down the landing and crouched when I got to the stairs. I warily took 3 steps down, to get a view of the basement's entrance. The door was wide open. The shovel had been snapped in half. I raised my gun and pointed at the shadows in the area where I thought the body might be. It felt weird calling it a body, but I didn't know what else to say. I kept my gun level but heard a noise slowly getting louder. It sounded like a flock of birds landing on the roof. I looked around for its source and saw it. The body was crawling upside down on the ceiling. It had just crawled out of the doorway from the dining room into the living room and was coming straight for me. I stumbled backwards and ran back into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I hid under my bed and held my breath. One heard the body take dull, methodical steps until it stopped directly outside of my door. I fought the urge to scream. From my little hiding spot, I saw my bedroom door slowly creaking open and the body walked in. All I could see of it was its feet, which were clubbed and malformed like a polio victim. Its skin was bone white and dotted with dark purple pustules. Each step looked more painful than the last as it walked around my room. Its breathing was labored and muffled slightly by the plastic bag that it still hadn't taken from its face. I didn't move a muscle. I was paralyzed with fear. I don't think I even breathed. I watched it hobble around MV bedroom until it was satisfied I was nowhere to be found. It slowly turned around and walked back out. I stayed where I was for a few minutes, trying desperately to think of what to do next. I calmed myself, got my shaking under control, and rolled out from under the bed. The body was floating in the middle of my room, a meter or so off the ground. It was hunched over where it met the ceiling and looked directly at me. It dived towards me and I fired blindly. I was inexperienced with using a gun, but I was so close to it it was almost impossible to miss. All 5 shots hit their target. The body faltered in the air and slammed into my bedside cabinet. I got to my feet and scrambled to my door. I looked back to see the body convulsing. I ran in abject terror and made my way down the stairs in a controlled fall. I hadn't even reached the ground floor before the body came hurtling out of my room, flying through the air as if something had thrown it. One grabbed my keys from the little ceramic bowl by the front door and fumbled with them until I found the right one. I burst out of my house and ran frantically down the driveway to my car. I opened the door and fell into the driver's seat. When I looked up, I saw the body standing in the doorway of my house. It slowly reached for its face and ripped the plastic shopping bag off. I wish it hadn't. The body flung itself at the car, just as I got the engine going. It latched onto the hood and let out a guttural cry as it started to violently headbutt the windscreen. I pulled into the street and drove blindly into the night. Cracks appeared on the glass and I feared it would shatter. Its forehead was bleeding now, but it didn't seem to care. It was then I got a good look at its face. Its skin was a tallow white, with the mottled texture of chronic rheumatism. Its eyes were pure black, bulging from its head as if they were to fall out and leaking vile pus from the edges. Its nose and ears looked like they had been gnarled off by a rabid dog, leaving only scared shapeless stumps. The thing's gums were necrotic, its teeth were shattered and ripping through exposed nerves. All but the front canines, which seemed dagger-like and immaculate. I hit the brakes. The body flew from the hood and skidded across the tarmac road, degloving any exposed skin as it slid, leaving a trail of blood behind it. I revved my car before driving over the body for the second time that night. I stopped and collected myself. I took a deep breath in and another out. One held the steering wheel tightly and focused my mind. As I was calming myself, I saw something move from out of the corner of my eye. I looked in the wing mirror to see the body slowly rise to its feet. I turned around in MV seat and stared slack-jawed at it. It looked back at me before dropping to all fours. I watched as it scurried down the street to my house. It looked back at me one more time as it stood up and calmly walked into my home, the front door slamming shut behind it. At this point, a few neighbors had woken up. From the sirens in the distance, I knew at least one had phoned 911. One drove to the outskirts of town, parked up the bridge and slept for the first time in what felt like a week. I woke up to a teenager banging on my door, laughing as I jolted awake and running off to continue his walk to school. On a tank of fumes, I made my way to my sister's one right to you now from her guest room, my dog Lassie curled up at my feet. I planned on going back to my house. My sister had convinced me that most of what happened that night was just a weird experience with a crackhead. It wasn't until writing this all down did I realize how bullshit of an excuse that is. Visited a cult who kept their leader's body wrapped in Christmas lights and covered in glitter. I barely escaped with my life. The first time I saw Mother God, she lay in a blue sleeping bag, her face covered in glitter, her eyes missing. Someone had wrapped Christmas lights around her desiccated corpse, and now they strobed and twinkled merrily. Mother God is in stasis, a calm voice said from behind me. I turned, seeing Hope had followed me into the room. She was one of Mother God's most fanatical followers. She is taking all the poisons from the universe into her body. Soon, she will wake up and lead us towards ascension. You must hug Mother God, the deep male voice demanded. Through the shadows of the hallway, I saw Lama, a hulking mass of red hair and muscle. He held a pistol in one steady hand. She will take away your doubts and anxieties. Am not hugging a goddamned corpse, I spat angrily, wondering how I kept getting into these bizarre situations. How come you guys didn't call a doctor when she was dying? What the hell is wrong with you people? Mother God is not dead. Lama screamed in an insane voice. How could God possibly die? And why would we call a three-dimensional doctor, anyway? Mother God is a five-dimensional being. They wouldn't even know where to start, Hope said, her eyes wide and gleaming. Lama nodded in fanatical agreement. I wondered where the rest of them were. I looked around, trying to find a way out. I knew they had my 2-year-old son downstairs, playing with the other kids who lived at the compound. If you don't hug Mother God, you will be recycled into the galactic center, Lama said, pointing the pistol in the middle of my forehead. He wore some strange combination of a shawl and a poncho, the once colorful material now dull and fraying. I could smell the sage and weed permeating his clothes. Lama looked at me with eyes the faded green color of swamp water. His long beard looked far greasier than the last time I had seen him, his skin sunken and gray. One turned, staring down at the mummified corpse. The papery flesh hung tightly to the grinning skull. The lips had been eaten away, showing yellowed, cracked teeth. The nose, too, had collapsed into the center of the face. 2 ragged sinus holes covered in dried yellowish pus and clotted blood marked the spot. The smell emanating from Mother God's desiccated body was sickening, a combination of cinnamon, feces, and rotting meat. "Do it," Lama demanded, shoving the barrel of the pistol into the small of my back. A sharp stabbing pain shot up my spine as I stumbled forward. "Do it," Hope repeated in her droning, emotionless voice. I looked down at the corpse sprawled across the floor. Inhaling deeply, I held my breath and lowered myself down on my knees. Mother God's grinning, half-decayed skull almost looked like it was trying not to laugh. One held my breath so as to avoid inhaling the rank odors rising from the decomposing body. Hesitantly, leaned forward, extending my trembling hands towards Mother God. I wrapped my arms around the sleeping bag, hugging the corpse gently. I wanted to avoid releasing any more gas bubbles, as the entire room already smelled of infection and shit. Mother God's thin arms cracked like dry chicken bones. Black fluid dribbled from her mouth, reeking of sewerage and bacteria. I closed my eyes, trying not to vomit. "Isn't it beautiful?" Hope asked as I pushed myself up, wavering on my feet and trying not to puke. She stroked her long brown hair over and over, as if trying to calm herself down. "Can't you feel all the love radiating off of her? She is the center of everything, the storehouse of compassion," nodded, continuously swallowing all the saliva flooding my mouth to try to keep from retching in front of these insane fanatics. The smell of feces and rot seemed to have grown stronger in the room. I remembered the children on the floor below us and felt a rising sense of horror as I realized they had been living in this house with a corpse for weeks. "Need to go check on Davy," I whispered, feeling my heart racing. Everything seemed unreal, as if I were trapped in a nightmare. Lama stood like a statue, the pistol pointed down by his side. His eyes were half closed, as if he were in some sort of stupor. Hope crept up behind him, putting her long fingers on his shoulder. Lama's eyes flew open as if he had just woken up. "Davy is fine," he said in a robotic monotone. "Everything is fine. We are one. We are one," Hope repeated excitedly. "All one. Okay," I whispered slowly, looking between the two of them. "I'm going downstairs then." I took a step toward the door. A moment later, I heard the floorboards creaking. I glanced back, seeing Hope and Lama following closely behind me, whispering to each other in low, conspiratorial voices. 37% even in the sprawling living room downstairs, the cloying smell of dead flesh followed us. I saw Davy sleeping on a beanbag next to a little girl, looking as peaceful as a tiny angel. "Did you guys see Mother God?" another girl named Aurora asked. She was laying on the couch next to a smoking glass bong. "She is still in stasis," Hope answered grimly, her eyes sad and downcast. "She has not yet awoken to lead us into ascension." Aurora sat up, flicking a lighter and filling up the bong with thick, gray smoke. The skunky smell did nothing to cover up the reek of decaying meat, however. It seemed to combine with it into something even more nauseating and sickening than before. One had not come here for no reason, though I now regretted bringing Davy. My brother, Lee, had been missing for nearly a month. The last time I heard from him, he told me about making new friends in this laid-back compound where everyone ate mushrooms and talked about spirituality all the time. Then his phone shut off, and he seemed to just disappear. I wasn't too worried, to be honest, as Lee was a full-grown man and could take care of himself. But after 5 weeks, my mother and father begged me to try to find him and make sure he was okay. Now that I was here, I wasn't confident that he was. I wondered how to bring up the subject to these nutjobs. Hey, you guys aren't holding prisoners in the basement like some kind of Gary Heidnik horror house, are you? I'm sorry, I'm being rude, Aurora said, turning her dark eyes to me. Like Hope, her face was caked in far too much makeup and had a somewhat blocky, unattractive quality. Her nose was just slightly too big, her forehead too high, her cheekbones too bony. Other than Aurora's hair, which was dyed pink and black, she might have been twins with Hope. She raised the bong to me. You said you're friends with Lee, right? Do you want a hit? Waved my hand in front of my chest. No, I'm good, I said. Actually, Lee's my brother. He dropped off the map a few weeks ago, and my parents just wanted to make sure he wasn't dead in a ditch somewhere. Didn't realize it at that moment, but things were about to get a lot stranger than they already were in the compound. I heard a shrill keening, rising in volume. It sounded like the cries of a panicked, injured animal. It drew closer. My head ratcheted over to stare at the basement door, which flew open. A naked woman with frayed strands of thick rope still tied to her wrists exploded through the threshold. She looked scarecrow thin, and her pale, white flesh covered in deep purple bruises and angry red gashes. Help me, she cried, staring directly at me. The rest of the room went deathly silent. I heard the crying of Davy and the other children as they woke up, surprised by the sudden screaming and slamming. What are we doing out of the learning room? Llama asked in a voice seething with psychopathic coldness. She screamed and tried pushing past Llama and Hope, heading toward the door. Hope fell backwards, her eyes wide and surprised as she smacked her head hard on the dirty carpet. Llama was much faster, however. He reached for his holstered pistol. It came out in a black blur. He fired only once, hitting the woman in the center of the forehead. A small, perfectly round entrance wound appeared like magic. Her head jerked back, her hands clenching into fists. Her naked, battered body fell backwards as if in slow motion. She lay there, bleeding and twitching on the floor, her fingernails and lips turning blue. I heard a lighter flick and saw Aurora nonchalantly filling up the massive 4-foot-tall glass bong. Davy's small body stumbled across the room toward me, tears and snot streaming from his tiny, pinched face. I ran toward him, picking him up and hugging him. I felt the warmth radiating off of him as his arms closed around my neck. Turning, I decided I needed to leave immediately. I started heading toward the door without a word, but Llama stepped in front of it, his emerald eyes flashing with excitement and pleasure. And just where the fuck do you think you're going? He asked, a Cheshire cat grin splitting his bearded face. He ran his fingers through his fire-red hair, looking as calm and collected as a Buddha. Don't you want to see your brother? No, I think I'm good, stuttered nervously. Llama put the hand with the pistol in it around my neck, leaning on me like an old friend. He's here, you know, he whispered in a conspiratorial voice. He wants to see you, too. We can't let you leave until you see Lee, Hope said from behind me. She had crept up on me, and her voice was only inches away. I saw her holding a long, serrated knife covered with dark crimson stains by her side. The handle looked sticky with gore. Why did you kill that girl? I whispered, feeling Davy's rapid heartbeat beating through his shirt. I cradled my son in my arms protectively, but I was surrounded on all sides, the only exit blocked. Llama shook his head, looking like a disappointed parent. She tried to escape and tell others about us, he said. The world is not ready for us yet. Mother God has not awoken. We try to be compassionate here. If anyone tries to escape, they go to the learning room, where they can be taught anew. She was worthless anyway, Hope spat with hatred, prodding the still corpse of the naked woman with one shoe. Always complaining about how much she missed her family. This is our family now. The intergalactic family of love. Her eyes shone with fanaticism. Do you want to see the learning room? Lama asked coldly. Is Lee down there? Said. Lama shrugged. Why don't we go see for ourselves? He asked in response, jamming the barrel of the pistol into my stomach. Davy's crying had quieted to a soft whimpering. Carrying my son in my hands, I turned and walked across the room towards the stairs to the basement. The steps looked dank and wet, flat slabs of concrete descending into a dark pit. Lama followed close behind me as our steps echoed off the gray walls. I was surprised at just how deep this building went. We went down at least a couple stories in the claustrophobic concrete tunnel. At the bottom, I beheld a nightmarish scene. A single flickering incandescent bulb overhead cast the dungeon in a dim light. A naked man was tied in the center of the room, his arms held straight up above his bowed head with knots of thick, brown rope. Deep, infected slashes ran across his back, the wounds suppurating and spreading in black patches. His entire body appeared like a road map of torture marks, bruises and clotted pus. All around the concrete walls of the room, someone had glued thousands of dismembered eyeballs. Most of them looked like they came from animals, but not all. Many were no more than rotting drippings of vitreous fluid and gore, yet others looked fresh. The smell of septic shock and decomposition hung thick and rank in the air, and I realized that not all the fetid odors in the house had come from the corpse of Mother God. From a dark corner, a silhouette stepped forward. I saw the form of my brother, his dark eyes blazing. He looked totally unharmed. He gave me a crooked half-smile. Lee. Holy shit. You're okay. I said, surprised. He nodded patiently. Father God is in charge of the learning room, Lama said. I looked between him and Lee, confused. Then the realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. You're not being held prisoner here? I asked, a rising sense of horror gripping my heart with a suffocating strength. Lama laughed at that, a sardonic, low chuckle of mirth and sadism that echoed through the room. The torture victim stirred, raising his bloody head slowly. I saw one of his eyes had swollen shut. Blood dribbled from a purple lump the size of an orange. His other eye opened, looking watery and unfocused. Help me, he whispered in a voice choked with pain. Lee stepped forward. In a flash, he struck out at the bound man, bringing a fist up into his jaw. I heard a crack of bone as a tooth flew out of his bloody, swollen mouth. Stop it. What the hell are you doing? I asked, still holding Davy in my arms. Davy hid his face into my chest, not looking at the torture and dismemberment surrounding us on all sides like a tomb. He tried to sell us out to the men in black. Lee said, pointing an accusing finger at the naked man as he spat blood on the cold concrete floor. We caught him talking to them. What the hell are the men in black? I asked. Lee looked hard at me. We don't really know. They keep showing up here in flashy, colorful cars. They always wear sunglasses to cover their bulging eyes. Sometimes they have extra fingers, and they're always long and twisted. They say they're from the US government, but they don't look like government agents to me. They wear garish ties and colorful hats that no CIA agent would be walking around in, Lee said grimly. Since Mother God went into stasis, I've been leading the group. Before she fell asleep, we were interconnected souls. We think the men in black are sent from the Illuminati, Lama said from behind me. The naked man just shook his head, fresh streams of scarlet dribbling down his chin. Never talked, the man whispered. Father God caught you red-handed. Lama screamed in fury. Lee looked like he would strike the man again, his dark eyes narrowing to slits, but at that moment, Hope ran down the cold, concrete steps, waving her hands with manic energy. "They're back. They're at the front door, and they want to see you," Hope cried, looking at Lee for guidance. Lee's face went pale, his eyes widening. The three of them ran upstairs, leaving me alone with the naked man in the room full of rotting eyeballs. "Arm yourselves," I heard Lee scream overhead, the words echoing down the cold steps. Divided by 36%, one glanced back at the naked man, who was hanging unconscious again, the weight of his body dragging painfully against his arms. The sound of shooting reverberated from upstairs in a deafening series of bangs. Someone started screaming in pain. "They're coming in," heard Lee yell, his voice tinged with a kind of fear I had never heard there before. I ran upstairs, taking the cement steps 2 at a time, eager to get out of the learning room and out of this house of such madness. One slammed through the door, sending it smacking against the wall with a clatter. The smell of blood and gun smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the omnipresent odor of death that permeated the house. Aurora was laying sprawled in front of the threshold, half of her face blown away and charred to a smoking heap of burnt flesh. It didn't look like the work of any bullet. A spreading puddle of blood wreathed her head like a halo. Llama lay in the corner, half of his chest blackened and exposed. His face was a mask of sweat. His clothes had melted to his skin. With wide, unbelieving eyes, he gurgled, rasping and suffocating. The smell of cooked human flesh and burnt hair hung thick in the air. I thought I could see his heart beating through the blackened gore of his torso. The rest of the cultists lay dead or dying. I saw the children gathered together in a corner, hugging each other, their faces pale. Their cries mixed with the gurgling of the dying. The front door stood wide open, letting the bright light stream in from the dirt parking lot. Silhouetted in the center of this effulgence stood the silhouette of a tall man in a suit. I felt like I couldn't focus on him, as if the lights grew brighter if I tried to look in that direction. He stopped into the room, causing his features to come into focus. It seemed the spell had broken as quickly as it had started. 2 more men in black suits followed him a moment later. At first glance, they seemed normal enough from a distance, anyways. And yet, my horror grew as I stared closely at the newcomers. Their faces looked as smooth and perfect as a glass pane. They each had a pair of expensive, black sunglasses. All of the hair on their bodies appeared to be missing, even their eyebrows. They all wore brightly colored, garish ties and undershirts that didn't match their black suits at all. They had no lips. Instead, they looked like they had drawn a crude facsimile of them with blood-red lipstick. Their fingers were long and twisted, looking as if they had far too many joints. Each tapered into points. I realized with increasing unease that they had no fingernails, no lines on their palms. Like their faces, their hands almost looked as if they were made of white marble, free from all lines and imperfections, gleaming with an inhuman smoothness. The man in the front removed his sunglasses. I saw his eyes were alien, monstrous things. They bulged from their sockets, the membranes looking as tight as a snare drum and ready to burst. Long, slitted black pupils ringed by irises, the sickly yellow of a suppurating wound stared out at me. "Are you with these humans?" he hissed in a low voice that seemed to split and distort. "Are you a follower of the one they call Mother God?" "No. We're innocent," pleaded. "Have no idea what's going on here." Davy wailed in my arms, his small face pinched with terror. The man in black put a long, gnarled finger on Davy's forehead. The boy instantly went silent, his eyes suddenly taking on a faraway, glazed look. "That is certainly fortuitous," their leader gurgled. "For Mother God was a thief, stealing our secrets. Thankfully, most humans will regard her as insane and rambling, but we can never be too careful, can we? Not with secrets." The S sound of the last word dragged on until it exploded into a reptilian hissing. One realized all three of the men in black had their smooth, marble-white jaws hanging open. Serpentine tongues flicked out as they hissed in unison. I backpedaled away in terror, seeing the back door of the cabin standing open. The corpses of the cultists littered the floor all around me, puddles of blood spreading under their slowly cooling bodies. In the corner, Llama still twitched, his bloody face a mask of confusion and agony. "I'm not involved in this," I said to the leader, hugging my son tightly. "I didn't shoot at you guys when you came in. I just came here to check on someone, but he's dead now, so." "You are involved," the leader said. "You've seen too much." He had his small, toy-like ray gun by his side. It looked like it was made out of some gleaming silvery material that constantly shone with an inner light. "Put the child down in the corner with the others," he demanded. I just shook my head. "We will not harm the children. These are too young to speak or understand anyway." The two men in black behind the leader stepped forward, raising their small, toy-like guns at me. I trembled inwardly. The leader came forward, looking as if he would rip Davy right out of my arms. But, at that moment, chaos broke out. I saw a blur of sudden movement from the corner. Llama's dying, glazed eyes glittered with an ineffable surge of joy and fanaticism. Crawling forward towards the men in black, I saw he had a pistol in one trembling hand. I tried not to look, staring into the leader's reptilian eyes instead. Okay, I said slowly, pretending to put Davy down. At that moment, a series of gunshots rang out, deafening in the enclosed room. The men in black all spun towards Llama, seeing his mutilated, bleeding form only 9 or 10 feet away. Llama's bullets hit the leader in the neck, causing a waterfall of blood to surge down the leader's garish clothing. But it wasn't any sort of blood I had ever seen before. It was as pale and white as the men in black's skin, filled with what looked like tiny pieces of opalescent glitter. The other two instantly responded by firing their alien pistols back at Llama, sending orbs of cyclonic fire ripping through the air with the smell of ozone and smoke. I took the opportunity to flee towards the back door. The sounds of the gunshots and the eerie keening of the fireballs followed me all the way to my car. Parked next to me was the car the men in black had come in, a garish, bright orange VW Bug with federal plates on it. I flung open the door to my car, quickly put Davy in the passenger seat and rummaged in the glove box for my knife. One heard it click open. The house had gone silent by now. Knowing I was out of time, I ran toward the VW Bug, stabbing at the two tires on the driver's side. I heard the hissing of air as they quickly started deflating. One hopped in my car, hearing the door slam open behind me. Two of the men in black ran out, shooting balls of fire at my car. I heard one ping loudly against the truck, sending the car fishtailing wildly. Davy screamed in terror, certainly traumatized by this horrid experience. After nearly crashing, I managed to right the car. Putting the accelerator down as far as it would go, one fled that place of nightmares, seeing balls of fire smashing the trees all around me as I went.